see the video, I will have that uploaded onto YouTube and in the show notes, but we're gonna go through some videos right now. So for those looking and for those who I guess are just listening, I have a file pulled up that has 6 different videos, 6 different angles, and then a couple different speeds, speeds being kind of slow motion versus regular motion of myself running. So I can probably not describe it as well as Dr. Vincent could. So Dr. Vincent, could you go ahead and maybe just tell listeners and watchers what they're looking at right now with these 6 panels on the screen, what kind of views they're showing?
All right. So Brady, let me ask, do we have, is the middle panel, is that your self-selected speed? And then the faster speed is on the right panel?
Yes, I believe that's correct. Yep.
So what I like to do for the listeners and the viewers is I like to have the skeleton model up because it's a very stark contrast to the actual real-time video that we're looking at on the screen. So the views that we can get with cameras are complemented by the computer model of the skeleton. And sometimes when you see bones moving, it shows something very clearly that might be a little bit trickier to pick out with the naked eye from a film. So the skeleton model that I look at, and I'm smiling as I look at the skeleton because I can very clearly see a couple of the things that we talked about. So my goal when I look at a gait analysis is to review the films for alignment. So how are your feet, your knees, your hips, and your shoulders all lined up? And is it looking linear up and down from the front? And then from the side, does your body have a nice overall slight forward lean to it as you're moving? And how are the feet placed on the ground relative to the hips? So I use the skeleton as kind of my go-to if I need that. But when I look at the high-speed film, so let's take the side view down on the left-hand corner. And the side view is a nice place that I like to start just to get going because this is where most of the motion occurs in the running form. From this point of view is from the side. So if this is what you've got at home and you've got a phone camera that you can use, this is a great place to get started. So what I'm looking for on the side here is the overall body alignment. If we have a nice little forward lean going, what are his feet doing when he lands on the ground relative to his pelvis? So here he's got a gorgeous, really long stride, but his feet are landing way out in front of his balance point, his center of mass, or the hips. And so we might probably want to shorten that up just a little bit if we can. What I do like is that after he makes contact with the ground, he flexes his knees very nicely. So I also look for soft landings. And knee bending is a good way to look at that. We don't want to hit the ground with a really straight leg with the heel out first. So if you film yourself and you see that, we want to make that correction and adjustment. Shorten up those steps a bit and make your knees bend a little bit, almost like you're softening your footballs. I love how Brady is landing on the ground with his foot. He's making a beautiful foot contact that's off the heel and more from a mid to a forefoot strike. And we can talk about foot strike in a little bit more if people have questions about that, because I know that that can be confusing. But what I'm looking at is a combination of the technique that he's using to interact with the ground. Is it soft or not? I also look at going a little bit higher up the kinetic chain. Now I look at the pelvis and the hips. And from the side view, I just want to make sure there's not excessive rocking or wrenching back and forth. We expect that there's going to be a little bit of forward and backward motion, especially at the fast speeds that Brady's running at, but we don't want it to be so excessive that it's going to be wrenching the spine or putting a lot of stress on the hamstrings or the Achilles when you land on it. And then also from this point of view, I look at what the elbows are doing. Are they pulling back evenly? Do we have a nice even use of arms forward and backward? And where's the head position? So sometimes people compensate and lean way too far forward at the waist and bend, and that can get us into a little bit of trouble, contribute to knee pain and back pain, but also it can draw the head forward and then you start leading with the chin and the head, and that's also uncomfortable. So we just want to make sure we have a nice contained compact form from the side. So overall, there's a lot to like. I think we're just going to work a little bit on stride length and making sure that we're taking a look here at what his arms are doing in terms of crossover as well.
Yeah, the arm crossover, definitely one of the things that we had talked about in depth for sure.
And it's hard to see it from this side, but if you see the hands disappear from the side view and kind of wrap around the front of the body, that's an indication we want to kind of get them moving a little bit more front to back instead of around and around like twisting.
Yeah, and I think that one becomes even more prevalent if we look at the kind of the back view. You can kind of see how far my wife, I was showing her my videos and she said it looked like I was running with chicken wings. So if anybody needs needs an analogy.
A little bit of the chicken wing going on. So now what I do is I look at the frontal view, which are the two panels in the middle. So I look at his body from the front and from the back. So just kind of opposite views and get a feel for what he's doing. And usually I just want to make sure that what I'm seeing from the back is the same I'm seeing from the front. Sometimes odd things can happen, but I always start with the feet. And are the feet crossing over like he's running on a line, or is he able to keep space between his feet so that he's almost running on the sides of a line, or like down a strip on the road, the roadside paint line? If you can do that, that's good. So what I see when I look at Brady's form here is that the strides look enormous and gorgeous from the side, but as soon as I look at him from the front, because they are enormous, he's reaching way out in front of his body and the feet are crossing over. And now what that's going to do is create a lot of stress that can happen at the ankles, especially at the knees, and potentially at the back and the hip, depending on what other motion is going on here. So we want to widen the stance a little bit, and we can very clearly see that also from the back view as well. Now let's go a little bit higher up to the knees. What's interesting is that his knees, when he's not standing at rest, he does not have like a bow out leg appearance. But when he's running, he gets this very interesting knees out to the side appearance, which is meaning he's changing his mechanics when he's running. So now that means I have to look a little higher up toward the hip and the pelvis about what's causing that lack of control. And so when we looked at what he's doing at the hips and the pelvis, that's his anchor point. I want to make sure around the anchor point of that pelvis that we're not having a lot of up and down or rotation happening here. And when I look from the back view at his pelvis, I'm seeing some asymmetric up and down going on here. Part of that is because his steps are so large. The other part is he's also rotating his pelvis to get that extra reach. So what we need to do to correct a lot of these things from the hip down is shorten up the step length and really activate muscles around the hips and the pelvis. And so maybe Brady, I can ask you, once you gave that a try, what did that feel like to you?
Yeah, so when we practiced these afterwards and I shortened my stride length, it felt, as you kind of said it would, it felt very awkward at first because, you know, I told you it almost felt like I was running kind of with a stick up my butt because I was trying to activate my hips and my glute muscles, as well as, you know, like you said, sort of run as I was sort of straddling a line and shorten my strides up. So it felt awkward, but I did mention to you that how much less stressful it felt just on my feet and sort of on my hips. I felt kind of the weight and the activation shift towards more kind of the posterior side of my body and, you know, activating those glutes a little bit more. So it felt great. After more practice, I'm sure it will feel much better versus, you know, just trying to change your form up on the spot where, you know, you got to get over the initial awkwardness. But no, I definitely, just by that small change of kind of activating consciously, trying to activate my glutes and shortening the steps, I felt massive changes in terms of how I was able to prevent my feet from crossing and things like that. So I definitely noticed it was certainly noticeable.
Good. And that's what he's describing to the listeners is absolutely normal. It will feel weird. It feels strange to do something different. If you imagine, if all of you runners out there, you've been doing a certain pattern for a long time. So your brain has this wired in pattern of what you feel like you should be doing and what your normal is. So when you make adjustments, and we'll look at the next videos here on the right-hand side in a minute, what Brady used was a combination of watching video, by feeling and getting feedback from testers to try and see if we could make small adjustments to allowing his muscles to do the work of dampening the force impact that he really had. So we did a before and after report to show the kinds of improvements that he was making. And these take time. You can make adjustments in one session, but you get better and better and better with more and more practice. So with a lot of the research out there, wavers anywhere from 1 practice session out to 8. And you get better and better with adopting the form the more times you do it and the more feedback you have. So I know that that might be difficult for people who are coming from a distance or from out of state, which is why I recommend using the phone at home or have somebody film you from front and back and give you feedback as you're going, just to make sure you're kind of hitting those cues like you want to.
And then Dr. Vincent, sorry to interrupt, if somebody wanted to kind of implement some of these suggestions, you know, I was mentioning to you how I don't think I want to go on an entire, say, you know, 6, 7, 8 mile run while I'm focusing on all of these cues, but what would you suggest would be the easiest way for somebody to, say, implement, you know, maybe just focusing on stride length or just focusing on activating some of the different muscles? You know, if they wanted to do that at sporadically during their run, maybe in 1 or 2 minute intervals, what would be the best way to do that?
Sure. And so I'm going to actually rephrase what you said and say what might be the healthiest way to do it, because there's the word best, I think, always makes people get driven toward a yes or a no answer, or kind of one pathway only. And what I think the science is actually showing us is that there's a couple ways to achieve this. You can either do, if you're not willing to cut down your volume of running, but you want to move in that direction of making these changes, insert intervals of doing this. For example, maybe 2 to 3 minutes at most at a time of interspersing a really concerted effort on making these changes. So let's say you go out for a 30-minute run. You might start with that warm-up, then fully engage in 2 minutes of focus, maybe fall back into your other pattern, and then 2 minutes, and then 2 minutes, and break it up. So that way you're not so exhausted at the end of the run mentally or physically that you feel like, you know what, I don't want to do this. Allow the body to adapt. And this is going to be key. If you went cold turkey and said, I'm going to switch everything that I'm doing and all of a sudden change over to that, you might get discouraged and feel tired and think this isn't as enjoyable as I thought it was going to be. So you can do intervals and over time lengthen those intervals until you've got a natural feel. Or if you cut down the volume completely, you can start with a shorter distance overall and just use this new form. So there's different ways that you can do it. It just depends on what your readiness is. And if you're recovering from injury when your distance is already low, or if you're feeling pretty good, but you just want to make change, try the intervals. Those might be some options for you.
Perfect. Perfect. And you're totally right in that it's so mentally taxing almost versus the physical. You know, it takes obviously some effort to sort of integrate these cues, but the mental focus that it just takes to focus on all of these things at once. Because I was trying to focus on glutes, shorter stride length, arms, you know, going up and down versus sort of side to side. So all of those things at once sort of can be a little bit of the mental overload. So you're going to finish a run feeling super tired, probably mentally and physically.
Right. And we don't want that. We don't want you to get discouraged.
Sure.
So, you know, listen to your body. The other thing you can do as well, you can also insert in little walk breaks. So for people who are doing this as well, look, take the walk breaks. And the reason I'm bringing this up is this is something now we've done for a few years. Whether you're a 15-year-old runner or you're a 70-year-old runner and you're making these changes, just insert that in a little bit, 1 or 2 minutes, just recoup, shake it out a little bit, mentally refocus, and then re-engage. And it can just make it feel a little bit more tolerable as you go. So that's also another strategy that you could try.
Awesome. Those are all great. And so I think that, I think these 2 videos I have on the right may be just the same, just my slower motion. So I don't know if they're necessarily any different. So we might not need to discuss any extras on them unless there was anything else that we kind of had discussed that you forgot and maybe you want to chat before we kind of go into my report card.
Yeah, maybe the one thing I do want to mention here is for the listeners who can't see this as well. The last thing that I looked for when I was watching Brady adjust his form is that he had a lot of back and forth, kind of wobbling motion on his upper body. So he was really using his trunk side to side to really get a lot of step length. And while trunk motion can be helpful, too much side to side actually can work against you because now your legs cross over in opposition to fight what your trunk is doing. So what I try and do is when I see a pattern, I try and help a person think of a movement pattern where it feels more natural, gentler and softer, and you're not fighting yourself as much and you're working more safely. And so as we talk about your report going forward and sort of the recueing that, actually, do you want to do the report first and then what we talked about with the recueing?
Yeah, sure. Why don't we go ahead and do that? And then so before I go to that, I will just mention, if anybody's watching, and one of the main things that you pointed out to me that has become so prevalent now is that if you're looking at the back view of me running, so from the back, you were talking about my trunk moving side to side and how hard my lower back muscles are working. My anatomy education is failing me, so I'm not quite sure what that muscle is. But when I take my left and my right stride, you can see the muscle prominently sort of just pop out on each stride. So that just, it was something that you showed me where I was like, oh, wow, you know, you asked me if I had lower back pain and I told you no, but you were kind of surprised just due to the fact that those things look like they're working so hard during my stride.
Yeah. He wins the award for the most profound activation of his back muscles. You could really see the striations in there.
I'll take it. I'll take what I can get. All right. So I will now, let's see, move on to my report card. Let's see here. Okay. So, and as we mentioned, so after we provide all the videos and we went over that, then Dr. Vincent during my analysis gave me a report card. So we have 3 pages and there are a bunch of all these different parameters. And so we can discuss maybe some of the primary parameters of interest here. We obviously don't have to go into this super in depth, but what on this first page here, we looked at things like center of gravity, cadence, and things like that. What were some maybe noticeable things here? And then why might those be important just in general for people to focus on?
Yes. So the reason we designed this report the way we did is that over the years, we've incorporated the emerging science. This report now is not the same as it was 3 years ago, as it was 6 years ago. We keep evolving it based on what the science is telling us and what we're learning. So this first page for us really is extremely important because they're very, very powerful measures, and that when you change any one of them in a good way, you can really change the entire rest of the report. And so a couple of the big ones on here that I pay really close attention to that you can very quickly change at home anytime include cadence, how many steps you're taking a minute, your vertical displacement. So it's a real fancy way of saying how much do you bounce. So we track that about where your belly button is. So how much does it bounce up and down every time you take a step? And then we look at your step lengths and your stride width. So your step lengths, I look at symmetry. I want to make sure that your body, just like walking and running, it should be your left and your right sides really should be doing the same thing. If everything's assuming everything is working correctly and that there's no weird issues with leg lengths or anything like that. So let's assume everything is anatomically aligned and correct. We're looking for symmetry. So when I scan down this page very quickly, I can see that Brady's cadence naturally, is this your natural one, your first one?
This is actually my faster speed. So my first one where we were about 7.5 miles per hour, I think my cadence was 171, and now it's 173 here. This was the faster speed.
Got it. So this is also something I want to bring up as well. So at this faster speed, this is a really good clip here. So compared to many of the runners that we have had doing their typical testing, the speed is a little bit faster than most of our other runners. So I do want to point that out. So his cadence is actually in a decent place. It's 173, and I get a lot of questions about cadence, and I saw that there was one from an interested listener about, is there truth about the 170 to 180? Should that be the ideal? So I'm going to rephrase that and say there is no such thing as an ideal. What we try and shoot for, what's going to give you healthy running motion and low impact forces. What's going to help you try and get your mechanics as safe as possible? Now, does that mean that's the same for a tall person, a short person, a heavy person, and so on? The answer is generally yes. So when you comb through the data, even when people do cadence retraining, most people can get their cadence above 170 and make really good, healthy changes. Now, if you can get it to 166 and you look great, fine, I'll take it. And it feels good to you, and that's what you can maintain for 10 miles. Fantastic. If there's ever room to get that up a little bit more, great. It's not going to hurt you. So just understand that the faster we can try and get it somewhere at least up to 170, that's pretty darn good.
So I'll have to pull up some of my older reports, but I think, based on what I was doing maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I think I've considerably increased my cadence probably by 7 or 8 steps per minute, probably.
Yeah, I think you have, if I remember that too. So even at his comfortable pace, he was going 171, and that's great. But we look at the speed change from 171 to 173, here's where the issue about speed comes from. We know that your step lengths are going to increase a bit with faster speed. That's normal, it will. We just want to make sure that you're also trying to move your feet faster. So your cadence should go up a little bit. That's what we're hoping for. If your only way of changing your speed is to make your steps longer, we got to change that up, because that's where we tend to see injuries take place if we really strain by trying to overreach. Let's work on also getting your feet moving a little bit faster as well. So we want both to increase, not just the length alone.
Got it. So faster steps, longer stride combined is the best way to increase your speed or get faster, go faster.
At least for what we know now.
Right.
Now let's go forward to step lengths. Right now, he's got step lengths that are about 1.3 meters. His left side is taking a little bit longer step than his right. So I just kind of keep that in the back of my mind and see if this is something we need to be concerned about or not. His stride width is extremely narrow. It's only about 4 centimeters, and that didn't change from his first speed. Now, what you can't see for the people who aren't able to see the videos is that this is a little bit of a misnomer. And so this is where I use the videos in addition to the number to make sense of it. We want that stride to be wider. There is no ideal. So again, I'm putting that context out there, but for him, because he's crossing over, he has no stride width. He was using his lower body like a pendulum, and we've got to get his feet more parallel, and with parallel feet comes wider stride width. It all works together. How do we do that? We increase our cadence, we take softer steps, and we activate our gluteal muscles. So the cues for Brady are all going to work toward making a healthier pattern with the same message here. So those are really the big things that I look at on this sheet. He's got a really good, I would say a pretty good stance time where he gets his feet up off the ground pretty quickly. I'm not worried about that. That looks good.
Yeah, and I don't have my slower speed here, but I think my step length was somewhere around maybe like 1.15, 1.2-ish or something, but it was definitely shorter. So as you were describing earlier, I certainly just seem to increase my speed, or when I run at a faster speed, do it all through increasing my stride length. So that's something to work on.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go on. We're on page 2 now of this report. So here we have some ground reaction force data. So what are we looking at here, Dr. Vincent?
Sure. So I know there's a lot of numbers on this page, and we put this on here for the people who are data lovers and like to track what they're doing. So we give you the real numbers, but then we also give you context of the so what. So the first column of information that we have here relates to really what are the actual units of force you're hitting the ground. And then we convert it over to body weights, which is more relatable to people, and it gives us a sense of really what's going on here. From those numbers, we can compare you to people in your same age group, sex, and foot strike type. So it gives you an idea of how you relate to others who are not injured that have very nice running form. So on this page, really what I pay attention to are how high are the peak forces when you're fully loaded on the ground. And that's usually during a mid stance. So when you're on one leg and you really put all your body weight on, is that symmetrical between the right and the left? And we hope it is. We want you to be loading equally. And for him, he is. So that looks really good, around 2.8 body weights. At faster speeds, we expect this number to go up. That's normal and natural. So this looks great. Now, how we get to that peak force is very important to me, because this impact loading rate is one of our risk factors that we know now for different types of injuries, including stress fracture, back pain, medial stress reactions, fibular stress reactions, and so on, metatarsal. So what I look at is how the shape of these ground reaction force curves appear on this paper. The steeper this curve, or the sharper the curve, the faster he's loading on the ground. And we don't want fast loading, because that means he's really braking really hard. We want him to use the ground like he's using it to sort of float off of. Just use it to get yourself back up in the air really quickly. And that's a hard thing to think about when you're running. So the cue that we give a lot of people to help address this, so for Brady in this case, he's hitting the ground on the left side with about 77 body weights a second, and on the right side about 54, somewhere in there. When we translate that over to our comparatives, he's on that upper range of impact forces. Part of that comes with speed. The other part comes with step length, where his foot is landing out in front of him, and the fact that he wasn't really activating his gluteal muscles and his hamstrings and the muscles he needs to cushion or soften those footfalls. And so part of the cueing is to address this page right here to say, land softly or lift your feet off the ground a little quicker. There's different ways runners can visualize how you do that. So this is where some of the retraining comes in to help encourage people to find the cue that works for them to land softly.
I think the best thing that you told me to work on here with the softer landing was to focus not on the downward push, but rather on lifting your knees when you run instead. So I also try to do that when I'm on like the stationary cycle, instead of sort of mash down on the pedals, pull up on the pedals, and that you kind of get the posterior chain activation, but then you do take a lot lighter steps for sure.
Yes, and thank you for bringing that up, because the lifting from the knee a little bit, it doesn't have to be dramatic. I don't necessarily want people, prancing around, and I know that that's what people feel like, is they feel like they're prancing, but really what you're doing is you are sort of pre-activating and preparing your leg muscles for absorbing the impact when you hit the ground. You're just waking them up instead of sort of passively hitting the ground. So it's just getting your body to think about, how do I prepare myself for interacting with the ground a little bit better? That's our goal.
All right, and then I'll just go to page 3 here. We can kind of discuss maybe just some of the final things. A very heavy data heavy slide again, but maybe we can just focus on some of the key panels and maybe some of the things that you find to be the most important.
Sure. So the last page that we see on here, otherwise we'd end up with a 25-page report for those who love the data. But really what I tried to create here was a panel or a screenshot, an overview of all the motion that your ankles, knees, hips, and pelvis are doing during a typical gait cycle. The one part that I would probably revise at this point is getting the trunk and the arms on here, because the trunk and the arms can drive some of the motion that we're seeing on this page. So just know that those changes are probably coming in the near future. But what we have here is during a typical gait cycle, from foot contact to loading, push off, swing, and all the way back down to foot contact again, what is your body doing? And how does your motion look? Is it symmetrical between the right and the left side, which on these pictures are the colored lines? That's Brady. So his right side is in red and his left side is in green. The colors only mean left and right. And because there's only one pelvis segment, there's only one line on the bottom pictures on the bottom of the panel here. So we're simply tracking the markers associated with each of the joints during the gait cycle. And if it's symmetrical, the colored lines are going to overlap. That's what we're hoping for. So symmetrical motion in a good way. The gray bars, the comparisons, are the expected motion that we might see from other healthy runners that don't have injury in the same comparative group. Now, if there's a speed differential between these, we understand, and there's context when we do interpretations here. So what I really use this for is symmetry and where we're really deviating. So very quickly, you can scan down. If we look at the left side first, that's the side view. So this is where most of the motion is coming from. And overall, I really like what I see. There's a lot of symmetry here, and I really didn't have too many comments on this at all. I think he does a great job with getting all of his joints moving in exactly the pattern that we would expect. So very nicely done from this point of view. Now, when we shift to the front, this is where a couple of the things that we could see with the naked eye also appear on the screen. So for those who can see the pictures, the very top middle picture of the ankle is showing something a bit odd. And what we recognize this as is an indication of the foot crossover. So this has nothing to do with him, purposely putting his feet in a pronated position or in a supinated position. This is happening because he's crossing his feet over so far, the computer is sensing it as something not right. So once we make those corrections, those lines drop down into the area where it's gray. That's the idea. If we go a little bit further, the other thing that we also notice here is the pelvic motion. So here overall at foot contact, right when he loads on the ground, things look great. As we get toward the point where he's pushing off and really driving, this is where we have some things changing here. And we have hip drop or hips, the knees drawing in toward the midline. So again, it's just affirmation that what we're seeing with our naked eye is actually creating something mechanical here. So for him, this all comes down to foot crossover and long stride length. That's how we're seeing that. And then finally, if we look top down, so this is the panel over here on the right-hand side. Again, we see variations here that are associated with the foot placement. He had more exaggerated leg movement in, if I can remember, on the left-hand side. Is that true, Brady, if I can remember?
Yes, correct. Okay. Yep.
And so what can happen is that there's compensation a little bit on the right side. When I interpret that and then I look down toward the pelvis, I also see that something happening here where he's using the right side of the pelvis to keep driving forward. So he's asymmetric at the pelvis as well. And you could also see that from basically the videos as well, if you're tuned in to knowing what to look for. So how would I interpret this? We just have way too much motion occurring around the hips and the pelvis that we need to control. The cues are going to be the same, but for him, this is how they're appearing on this report. So if we step further, do you want me to talk about the cues, Brady, how we interpret this?
Yeah, sure. Let's go ahead and do that. And then we can, wrap up this section. But yeah, I'd love to talk about that.
Okay. So when I take this whole story from the first page of the temporospatial, the really powerful metrics, to the ground reaction forces, to the motion, what we realize is that we need to have Brady work on trunk control, so less side to side and more anchoring the pelvis a bit. We need to really focus on activating the gluteals, taking shorter steps and really working on parallel feet and softer landings. It sounds like a lot. I'm going to boil this down to a couple main things to start with, because as a runner, you might say, oh my God, there's no way I can focus on that. I understand. And that's probably not realistic to expect that in the very first session either. So in a piece that we just finished writing for ACSM yesterday, to complement the healthy habits, we encourage runners to think about focusing on the big cues first and then worry about the little cues. So the big cues that are going to really be hard hitting for Brady are going to be the cadence and the landing softly. The third cue we're going to work on for him, once he feels pretty good about adjusting that, is really working on the truncal control. And the reason I'm using that approach with him is that so many good things already happened just with the first two. That's great. So work on the first two that you can get a lot of benefit from those first, and then continue to modify your form over time. So if there's too many cues to work on at first, let's do the big ones, and then continue over the weeks that follow to keep adjusting, and use feedback with a phone or having a partner take video of you to see if you're accomplishing that. So that's the approach that I would use with him.
Yeah, and like I told you, I'm very excited I was almost excited the same day to get on the treadmill and practice those, but I'll wait a couple of days before I begin. But all three of those cues, again, practicing them in the lab was super helpful. And yeah, I found them super helpful, and the immediate feedback was astounding as well. So I think that anybody who implements, whether the cues we talked about now, or maybe the cues we'll talk about for healthy distance running habits in a second, they're very easy to implement. Even if you just do a couple at a time, you can really see the immediate feedback. So again, I appreciate you going over my gait analysis again, but hopefully people find that interesting, as well as, the visual component